This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're going to explore the issue of contraband in New York State prisons and the efforts being used to keep it out. Our guest is Jennifer Scaife, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, which is empowered by state law to provide independent monitoring and oversight of state prisons. Thanks for making the time, Jennifer.
Thanks for the invitation.
Well, before we dive into the efforts to stop contraband, I'm curious what types of objects are actually covered in the definition of contraband, because I imagine it's more expansive than just illicit drugs and weapons. In fact, I know it is because a recent intervention of contraband, which we can talk about later, the list highlighted by state officials mentioned bandanas, hair clippers, and a cell phone. So is there a list of prohibited items or prohibited types of items?
Yes, and I think that list can vary depending on what type of security classification or unit an individual who's incarcerated is housed in. But broadly speaking, I think it includes the list of things that you just mentioned, anything that could be construed as an illicit substance, that could be construed as a weapon, or that could be used to facilitate an escape, for example, are considered contraband, and sometimes these things are surprising. And I think that the recent media coverage of drones dropping contraband into prison yards and some of the intercepted substances that have been recovered from people attempting to visit individuals in prison are examples, or the kind of more common examples that most people would be familiar with and expect that people in prison should not have access to, or aren't allowed to have access to.
But when you say something like something that could be used to help you escape, I imagine you could probably cast a pretty broad net in terms of what might be covered by that. So, from your experience speaking with incarcerated individuals or even talking with people who work in prisons, do you feel like the definitions that they use in practice are reflective of things that actually could be used to escape from a facility or could be used for a weapon, or do they cast a very broad net and grab things that maybe aren't relevant and maybe shouldn't be considered contraband?
I think that a lot of the rules in these kinds of settings were developed as a result of something that an extraordinary event that happened, right? So aerial photographs or maps, right, of prison facilities or areas around a prison are not allowed because they could conceivably facilitate someone finding his way out of a prison, having first tunneled through a wall buried 20 feet underground, right? So obviously the Clinton escapes in 2015 are prominent examples and extraordinary examples of ways in which individuals were able to breach the secure perimeter using tools that were smuggled into a prison, which I think is every prison administrator's worst nightmare. And yet the practical application of a map of New York State or a town where a prison happens to be is pretty useless for someone who doesn't have the tools available to tunnel out of a prison or breach razor wire. So I think some of them, I think, taken out of context, can seem a little far-fetched or comical, and yet I think that they also often arise from kind of extraordinary examples of security risks that have happened or have been known to have happened in other jurisdictions, if not in New York State.
Well, is there a good sense of how often contraband is making its way into facilities? Because I wonder if this is one of those issues where there's not good data and we're relying primarily on anecdotal accounts. And to the point about data, your organization has highlighted just the fact that there are changes in policies around drug contraband. I think that in recent years have made it more difficult to make, say, comparisons about past incidents to recent ones because of how they're, using the standard of confirmation analysis by an outside laboratory. So how do you get a good picture of contraband, and is a clear picture, emerging?
Good question. I think the short answer is yes. There is the department does keep track of contraband entering into facilities through unusual incident reports, which are generated at the facility level and communicated to the central office in Albany. The data that we have is currently about a year old, and so we don't have access to up to the minute trends in contraband, though we do have a data request pending. So the recently signed prison omnibus reform bill, among many other things, granted the Correctional Association of New York access to data about operations and trends in the prisons. And we have a pending request for unusual incidents that would allow us to see, as of the most recent quarter, what contraband looked like coming into facilities across the system. That said, based on the conversations that we have with facility administrators, so superintendents and correctional officers, security staff, and incarcerated individuals at prisons in New York State, we are aware that concerns about contraband, so primarily drugs and weapons or tools that could be used as weapons, are top of mind as safety concerns. And those kind of play out in a couple of different ways. One, concerns that drugs are creating, kind of driving this market, demand for them, and the kind of, underground market for obtaining them can be linked to violence in correctional facilities. There's also grave concerns about the dangerousness of these substances. So particularly substances that are coming through that are difficult to detect because they've been sprayed or soaked into paper and then can be smoked and can result in very unpredictable, erratic behavior that can lead to violence or can lead to serious health consequences for the individual who has consumed it, and even health consequences for staff who come into contact with it when trying to treat the individual who has suffered some sort of intoxication or overdose. So this varies from one facility to another, but we hear lots of concerns from staff and incarcerated people about these drugs. And then, of course, the other concern around contraband is weapons and just overall physical safety that, I think drive real concerns in the prisons, particularly in facilities where they're already concerned about understaffing and people who are kind of working long hours, feeling tired.
Sure.
So those are the contraband concerns that we hear a lot about.
Well, in terms of how contraband gets inside a prison, I imagine it's primarily from visitors and facility employees. But as we saw recently in March, and we're going to talk about the main ones in a second, but the issue with the drones that the state flagged with the interception in March at the Marcy Correctional Facility. Was this something that was on your radar prior to this? Obviously, the governor had flagged it in her state of the state and budget proposals with some language designed to essentially increase penalties around illegal drone activity. But what was your reaction to the Marcy incident with regards to drones and just this issue more broadly?
We have heard of drones dropping or attempting to drop contraband within prisons. We've also heard staff talk about things that were kind of lobbed over the fence. So yeah, I mean it's something that we've heard about. I think, and I guess I have to say I wasn't surprised, although it did seem like quite a bit of material was successfully dropped by the drone. most recently. But it was also surprising to me that anyone thought that it could really be recovered, because it was dropped in the middle of the night, and incarcerated people don't have freedom of movement overnight, and so there was very little risk that, or likelihood, I should say, that this was going to wind up recovered by the intended recipient. And I don't mean to make light of it, because I think that anyone who works or is housed inside a correctional facility, it's kind of their worst nightmare, that knives would wind up in the hands of someone who wanted to use them. So it's scary, and yet I think that, as you say, the more common entry points are through people actually walking through the doors, as opposed to attempting to fly a drone overhead.
Well, lastly, on this point, there is the governor's proposal to prohibit the use of drones in a quote unquote nefarious manner, restricting activity in certain areas, like around correctional facilities. Any position on that legislation?
From my narrow point of view, seems like a wise idea. I think my concern or question really more is, is this restriction going to serve as a deterrent? I mean, people already know that if they're doing this, they're doing something that's illegal, and so I'm not sure that this will solve the problem. Though if it serves as an additional deterrent, I'm sure that can only help.
And after a quick break, we'll explore efforts to ensure that visitors and staff at prisons aren't bringing in contraband with our guest, Jennifer Scaife, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided in part by the Lawsuit Reform Alliance of New York. Fraud and lawsuit abuse impact car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.
Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell and Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com.
This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're continuing our conversation about contraband in prisons, including what constitutes contraband and efforts to keep it out. Our guest is Jennifer Scaife, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, which is empowered by state law to provide independent monitoring and oversight of state prisons. Well, let's turn to the more traditional ways of getting contraband into prisons. And why don't we start with visitors? Right now, if you want to gain entrance to a prison, you're supposed to go through these body scanners. And there's even legislation right now dealing with how policies around those are applied to visitors. What are your thoughts on the status quo?
What we've observed over the past months, year or so, is really kind of an evolution of the department adapting to more widespread use of body scanner technology and responding to some of the reforms that have been put in place over the past couple of years. And so certainly we have heard of visitors who have had trouble getting through security due to, either the perception that canines, so drug sniffing dogs, being used in a security sense at the visiting, the security, processing line are being too aggressive, or being, used in a way that is intended to be intimidating. So that's something that we've heard people express concerns and complaints about. And then, of course, we also have heard a number of complaints about the use of body scanner technology and the kind of perceived misuse, where people who may not know exactly what they're looking at, flagging a visitor for suspected smuggling of contraband when that individual had a medical device or a menstrual hygiene product, or some other anomaly in or on their body that couldn't be identified, and then they were either restricted in some way from visiting or turned away.
And just to follow up on that point, New York Focus has made the case that the Department of Corrections body scanner policy doesn't really give good guidance on how to read images, and as a result, the employees might interpret body scans differently. There's no set standard, for example, on how to read things, and so then you have this just case by case discretion. Is that your understanding?
It sounds to me like that was happening quite a bit more prior to the department rolling out more comprehensive training. And
Okay.
it seemed like there was quite a bit of discretion, quite a bit of variability from one facility, even one individual operating the body scanner, to another. And we have been told that more recently there's been additional training, and one security staff member we spoke to recently at a facility said that he himself has a medical device, and he kind of offered himself up as kind of the prototypical visitor, went through the body scanner and allowed other staff to kind of review his scan to see what that device looked like so that they could become more aware. And based on what we've heard from staff recently, that the actual number of visitors who are being turned away, which facilities have to report to Doc Central office on a regular basis, is very small. And the numbers that they're turning away, they actually recovered contraband from those individuals. So this is what facilities are reporting to us, which is not to say that there aren't still issues for visitors going through the process. And I think that there is, as you say, some gray area, because policies are meant to, in order for them to be implementable, they have to allow for some discretion and some judgment, right? And so I think that that's the challenge, is that there is this kind of reliance on good judgment on the part of staff, and yet there are many staff across 41 facilities who are trying to operationalize this policy while, against the backdrop of kind of these serious concerns about the risks and consequences of contraband entering the facility. So I think that's the kind of tension that we're seeing play out through, these proposed legislations, some of the reporting, and then the kind of on the ground reality. And visiting has been restricted since the unauthorized work stoppage a year ago, ended over a year ago. And so where maximum security facilities used to have 7 days a week for visits, in most of those maximum security facilities, visits are only happening on Saturdays and Sundays. And so you've also got the kind of additional stress and kind of pressure of processing all of the visitors who want to come in and see their loved ones in a much shorter, concentrated time than visitors at those facilities are used to having.
Well, turning to the staff in the facilities, has been noted during the pandemic, visitors were not getting into facilities, but contraband was getting into facilities. So clearly, prison staff are and likely continue to play some role in the contraband that gets into facilities. And one of the tools that's supposed to be used to catch staff bringing it in are the body scanners. But as the State Department of Corrections commissioner testified to lawmakers earlier this year, we're still 90% or more of staff not going through body scanners. So I'm curious what you think about the checks and balances that are in place right now to keep the prison staff from bringing in contraband.
There was a new policy implemented, I think it was back in January, that now requires all staff entering correctional facilities to be processed through a metal detector. So not body scanner, right, which has a different kind of function, but metal detector. And you may recall that last November there was a tragic and shocking suicide by a staff member at Marcy Correctional Facility who walked into the facility with a gun and used it. So I suspect that this new policy was implemented in part in response to the need to ensure that staff weren't bringing in weapons or other kinds of contraband to harm themselves or that could be used to harm other people. And as you mentioned earlier, the bill that was introduced recently by Senator Salazar and Assemblymember Sue Front Forest would require that any individual, including staff, be processed through. It looks like the bill proposes a kind of rotating assortment of security screens, including body scanners, metal detection, and other kinds of frisks. So it looks like it's an evolving issue, and I think that the department is perhaps already attempting to get ahead of that through introducing this new policy a couple months ago that would that's requiring all staff to be processed through at least metal detection.
Anything else you think could be done to prevent or catch contraband, or maybe even reduce the demand for contraband in prisons?
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, another thing that we do hear from staff is that packages are a source of contraband, even though they have implemented some additional measures for detecting it through the package screening process. But I'm interested in this idea that you've introduced of demand, because it's something that I wonder about too, particularly around the demand for illicit substances, drugs, because we've heard from incarcerated people at a number of different facilities some kind of ideas that I think are really important and not discussed enough in this conversation around sealing off entry points for contraband, which must be, a priority. And yet I think that the missing piece of that conversation is really addressing what's going on in the prisons that is driving people to want weapons and drugs. And certainly there will always, we're talking about human beings, and we're talking about people who are being housed against their will in an environment where, there's material deprivation, right? So obviously there's always going to be a demand for things that people aren't allowed to have. And yet we've heard incarcerated people talk about the sheer kind of hopelessness and boredom of incarceration that drives people to kind of wish to numb themselves through the use of drugs, right? So this desire to get away from the environment that they're stuck in. And obviously, we know that people who are incarcerated have higher rates of substance use treatment needs than the general population. These are factors, I think. And then another thing that we've heard incarcerated people call for is a greater array of programs that address substance use disorders and frustration that the Alcohol and Substance Abuse Treatment Program, ASAT, which the department offers and requires for really a majority of the population. There are so few seats in those programs and such a long waiting list to get into them that people who might benefit from them are not able to access those programs, or people feeling as though they've gone through the program and they have kind of other issues, and that those programs, which kind of historically have been focused on abstinence as the model for recovery, as opposed to, a kind of harm reduction focus. So, an interest in more kind of modalities of substance use programming that could address a kind of wider range of needs among incarcerated people who are seeking out substances while they're incarcerated.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. We've been speaking with Jennifer Scaife. She's the executive director of the Correctional Association of New York. Jennifer, as always, thanks for making the time.
Thank you, David.
Support for Capitol Press Room comes from National Fuel, working to help customers understand what drives energy bills, from taxes and state-mandated programs to market-driven price increases for natural gas, which utilities don't profit from. More information at betterplansnobands.com.
And by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.